Hello, and welcome to our first lecture podcast for Assessment, Evaluation, and Planning, 432. It's a snowy day outside, so I decided to create our first discussion. So we're going to look at Chapter 1 of Wortham's book in two short podcasts. The first one here will look at general ideas about assessment and reflect upon why it's important, especially in early childhood education, and talk about some general practices for assessment. But then in our second little podcast, we'll be looking at the history of assessment, and I separate those for several good reasons. Let's first start, though, with the idea of what is assessment. So think about it for a second. What is your definition of assessment? So most of the time when I ask this question in class, most folks, their first thought is tests, right? So assessments are tests. And that's true to some extent, but tests are actually just one form of assessment. Assessment, as defined by Wortham and several other folks, is a larger process of gathering information about children from several forms of evidence. Then you organize, you collect, organize, and interpret this data, right? And so the big idea here is that whether you look at the National Research Council's definition or Wortham's definition or anyone, is that assessment is actually a system. Assessment is a larger systematic process of gathering information from several forms of assessment. And so when you think about tests, or you think about interviews, or you think about observations, perhaps, the different modes of assessment, these pieces these pieces all play a role in your assessment system, right? So it's really, really important to not have a very narrow view of assessment, because assessment is a larger piece, right? The whole class is actually termed assessment, evaluation, and planning, right? So the idea is that you use different modes or different forms of assessment in order to create a larger picture about the child. You also use these forms of assessment, your assessment system, to help you understand more about your teaching, more about the program that you've put in place. Assessment also helps us understand an evaluation of the school, perhaps, or the program that you're in, so even broader impacts. So assessment has, in fact, a lot of stakeholders, right, all the way up to the state and national governments. But the actual doing of assessment happens within these forms. And it's not important to know what all the different forms of assessment are, because these are the types of things that we're going to be looking at throughout this entire class, right? So we have specific days and weeks planned for observation, for interviews, for performance-based or authentic assessment, rubrics, a whole bunch of other assessment tools, and yes, tests. We do have to be able to create good performance assessments to help us understand where a child is. And to hit that last piece of the title of this class, Assessment, Evaluation, and Planning, assessment is only as good as it informs your instruction. And that's going to be the most important piece that I hope you take away from this course, is that assessment drives instruction. Another way that I typically like to put this is purposeful assessment drives meaningful instruction. And that's where I want us to go with this. So if you haven't written it down, and you will hear it from me, and probably 342 times throughout the course of this semester is purposeful assessment drives meaningful instruction, or assessment drives instruction. So why are you here in a specific assessment course for early childhood, right? Why aren't you in with the AYA or some other course on assessment? So what makes this so important that it has its own course, right? Well, you probably already know, but if you think about it, you are at the front lines of identification, right? So this is the first time when a child goes to school at age 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, it's the first time that they've encountered somebody else besides their parent or grandparent or guardian that is able to evaluate where the child is and help provide them feedback so that they can grow, right? It's also very important not just to be able to identify for intervention, so those early intervention makes all the difference, and it does, absolutely, and we know that, you know, all of the research points to that. So that's part of why you're here, to identify the weaknesses or major areas for improvement. Perhaps a child has a learning disability, perhaps they have some sort of other functional disorder, whatever it might be, but you're there to look for those weaknesses, but you're also there to understand the strengths of the child so that you can push them to the upper limits of their abilities, right? And this all starts very, very early, right? We understand how important early literacy is. We understand how important early numeracy is, social skills training, and so forth. This is what assessment is all about. It's about finding out the areas of strengths and weakness of the child so that you can plan your instruction and also communicate with the parents. Perhaps at no other time in life are parents as involved as they are in early childhood education. So communicating assessment results to parents is also enormously important. The second reason why early childhood assessment has its own course and things is that there are specific developmentally appropriate practices, as you know, that have to be enacted, like how children develop from 3 to 5, and then from or 3 to 6, and then let's say from 6 or 7 to 9 or 12. These are very different things, right? The child, the 4-year-old, is enormously imaginative and lives in another world most of the time, whereas your 7 or 8-year-old is much more involved in the idea of school, right? Much more aware and much more able to think concretely about actions and concepts and so forth. So, right. So the change of the child and how children develop is drastic between the ages of 3 and 8, or even 3 and 12. So part of your job is actually to be able, through assessment, is actually to be able to research what works, right? How do we best get a child to understand the concept of subitizing, for example, right? Which is to be able to identify the dots on a die when you roll a die. So that's also part of the importance of assessment in early childhood, is that research component. The third area, and I'll move a little more quickly here, is growth in multiple areas. So I already kind of mentioned this. The high school teacher does not care about the physical or I don't know, necessarily cognitive or social growth of a child, right? Or emotional at some level, right? I'm sure they do care about this, but it's more of their side job. Whereas for you as an early childhood educator, these 4 areas are enormously important, and you have to be able to help a child grow in each of these areas. So you have to be able to at some level assess how a child is doing, where they are developmentally as far as their physical, emotional, cognitive, and social growth, and so that's also what makes you as an early childhood educator so important, and it makes this section of assessment enormously important as well. So I'll move quickly here. This is just an overview. NAEYC, the National Association of Education of Young Children, if you don't know about them, and there's also an Ohio version of this. Very important to become involved in some of these areas and to also use the resources that they have. So if you're ever looking for research on how best to work with a child in specific areas, going to the NAEYC website is a good resource. So NAEYC says we use assessment for making sound decisions about teaching and learning, right? It's that reciprocal approach between learning about where the child is and how where the child is affects our evaluation of our program or of our teaching. Identifying significant concerns that require focused intervention. We talked about that. Early intervention is key. And last, helping programs improve their educational and developmental interventions. So in general, so getting broad overviews of where children are today is also very important for assessment. Last but not least, and I kind of take some of these from Wortham, but I also intermix some NAEYC as well. So there's some indicators of effective practice for early childhood educators. I'm not sure it's important that you write down all of these things, but just understand that number one, when you thought about assessment and what assessment was, you probably thought of tests, and you probably thought of how deceptive tests are, how ridiculous testing is. I'm sure you had a lot of other words that talk about how bad testing is, right? So one of the major important pieces to think about when you assess is that you are ethical. So if you ever feel, and I stress this at all points, if you ever feel that your children are being overassessed or that the assessment is causing harm or damage, then I feel that you should look inward and make a professional decision to say, I'm not sure that this is what I need to do because it's not in the best interest of children. And so, we can get into this in more in-depth conversations, but I think it's very important that you understand that there are ethical principles in the amount or the structure of specific assessments. So think about those as we move forward. What is assessed is developmentally, educationally significant, so that you are assessing something that's important, right? You gather evidence from realistic settings. Early childhood is children playing, and so hopefully, at least for the most part, and so being able to assess during play or during performance or during authentic assessment situations is really important. So that's somewhere that we begin in this course. Assessments there should be multiple assessments over time. One assessment doesn't always tell you the full picture. Sometimes two are a lot better at giving you some of the nuances of where a child is as far as their strengths and weaknesses. And then you limit the use of norm reference tests. So this is typically standardized tests to compare one child to a group of children. We'll talk more about that when we get there. And then good, effective assessment practice is that you are communicating this practice, you're communicating the results, the strengths and the weaknesses of the child with the parents, as we've discussed a little bit more. So that's all I've got for you in this one. A good 14-15 minutes of discussion on what is assessment, why it's important, and all those sorts of things. So continue reflecting. I'll have a reflection prompt for you later on, and thanks for listening.